cold, still it's deep, he said. The cowboy took her in from the storm and faced his past again. The sky had been quiet and clear in the early morning, with the sun barely peeking over the distant mountains. Jackson Cole had been up since dawn, as he usually was, tending to his small ranch in the remote hills of Montana. He liked the solitude.
The quiet gave him time to think, to be alone with his thoughts without the interference of the busy world. His life had always been simple, built around the rhythm of the land and the needs of his animals. Horses, cows, and a few chickens were all he needed. Still, the isolation often weighed on him. Some nights he felt the ache of loneliness, but he had learned to live with it. By mid-morning, the sky had begun to change. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, fast-moving and heavy. Jackson noticed it from the corner of his eye while checking the fence lines near the pasture. The air grew cooler and the first hint of wind whispered through the tall grass. Jackson frowned. Storms came quickly in these parts, and he had learned never to underestimate them. He glanced at the horizon and realized this one wasn't just any rainstorm. It had the look of something fierce. He whistled softly to his horses, urging them closer to the barn. The animals sensed the change, shifting uneasily on their hooves. Jackson tightened his grip on the reins and walked briskly among the cattle, making sure none had wandered too far.
It was routine work for him, but this storm felt different.
It wasn't just the dark clouds or the sudden chill. It was something in the air that made him uneasy, a tension he couldn't shake. Suddenly, through the haze of rain that had started to fall in light sheets, he saw a figure struggling in the distance. At first, he thought it might be a lost cow or perhaps one of the neighbor's animals. But as he got closer, he realized it was a person, a young woman, soaked to the bone, stumbling across the muddy field, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. She seemed terrified, moving as if the wind itself was pushing her back. Jackson's heart quickened. It wasn't common for anyone to be out here alone, especially not in such dangerous weather. Without a second thought, he swung his leg over his horse and urged it into a gallop. The wind tore at his coat and the brim of his hat, and rain stung his face, but he didn't slow. He reached the woman quickly and held out a steady hand. "Hold on!" he called over the roar of the storm. "I've got you!" She hesitated for a moment, clearly frightened, but her exhaustion won over her hesitation. She grabbed his arm, and he guided her to the safety of his horse. She climbed on carefully, trembling from both cold and fear. Jackson adjusted his own grip to make sure she was secure, keeping one hand on the reins. The wind lashed around them, and the first real drops of heavy rain began to fall. The storm had arrived in full force, and it was clear that staying out in it would be dangerous for anyone. The ride back to the cabin was tense. The storm made everything louder, the wind screaming through the trees, the rain pounding against the horse's back, and the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the hills. Jackson kept the horse steady, talking softly to the woman to calm her. "Almost there," he said. Just a little farther. He could feel her shivering against him, and he knew they needed warmth and shelter immediately. When they reached the small cabin, Jackson helped her down. The front door was old and creaked, but it opened to a dry, safe space. He led her inside, away from the howling wind and the cold. The cabin was modest but cozy, with a fireplace in the corner and the faint smell of wood smoke lingering from earlier that morning. Jackson guided her to a chair near the fire. "Sit," he said gently. "You'll be warm in a minute." The woman sank into the chair, still trembling, pulling her wet coat close around her. She looked up at him with wide eyes, soaked hair clinging to her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small and fragile. I didn't think anyone would see me out there." Jackson nodded, keeping his expression calm, though his mind raced. "The storm comes fast around here," he said. "You were lucky." "Could have been worse." He went over to the fireplace, kneeling to arrange the firewood so the flames would grow. Sparks danced and the warmth slowly began to fill the room. The woman, whose name he learned was Lila Harris, finally relaxed slightly as the heat reached her. She looked around the cabin with curiosity, taking in the simple furniture, the worn rug, and the tools neatly arranged on the walls. "It's quiet here," she said softly.
peaceful in a way I haven't felt in a long time." Jackson glanced at her, noticing the way her eyes softened, the tension in her shoulders easing. "It is," he said. "Quiet's all I've got most days. Helps you think, keeps your mind clear." He paused, then added, "You're safe here for now. Storm will pass soon enough."
For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the patter of rain against the roof. Jackson watched her, trying to guess how much she had been through, why she had been out alone in such terrible weather. Something about her made him uneasy. Not in danger, but in curiosity. She seemed fragile, yet there was a quiet strength in her eyes, a determination he recognized.
I was trying to get to the next town," Lila admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "My car, it got stuck, and then the storm hit. I didn't know what I was going to do." Her hands were still shaking, and Jackson noticed a small camera hanging from her neck, wet but intact. Jackson nodded. "Happens faster than you think out here," he said. He placed a blanket over her shoulders. "Better to stop and wait it out than risk getting lost." He avoided asking too many questions, knowing that pressing might scare her. People often revealed what they wanted when they were ready. As Leela sat there, warming herself by the fire, Jackson moved around the cabin, checking on the animals quickly. He needed to make sure they were safe from the storm, too. The horses were calm in their stalls, the cows huddled together in the barn, and the chickens were tucked in their coop. Only then did he return to the cabin, feeling the weight of exhaustion in his muscles but unable to ignore the concern for this stranger. The storm grew stronger outside, rain slashing against the windows and sheets, wind rattling the walls. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the small acts of care made a stark contrast. Jackson handed Lila a cup of hot tea he had brewed earlier, the steam rising and warming her face. She took it carefully, letting the heat seep into her cold hands. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steadier now. There was a vulnerability in her expression that tugged at Jackson's heart, a reminder of the fragility that sometimes hid behind people's appearances. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Jackson shrugged lightly, avoiding eye contact. "Wouldn't have let you get hurt," he said simply. "Nobody deserves that." They sat together in the firelight, the storm continuing outside, and for the first time that day there was a shared sense of calm. Words were few, but the silence was not uncomfortable. Jackson found himself watching her carefully, noticing the way her fingers traced the edge of the cup, the way her eyes flickered to the window as if fearing the storm would break in. He wanted to say more, to assure her that everything would be okay, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply waited, giving her space, allowing the fire and warmth to do what words could not. Outside, the storm raged on, powerful and relentless. Inside, two strangers shared a quiet moment of safety and understanding, a fragile connection forming without anything being forced. Jackson knew that taking someone in from the storm was more than an act of kindness. It was a choice to open his world, even just a little, to someone else. And as he looked at Lila, shivering slightly under the blanket, he realized that the storm outside was not just in the sky. Sometimes people carried storms within them, storms that could be just as fierce and unpredictable. And sometimes, helping someone through their storm could help heal your own. The hours passed slowly, the storm showing no sign of letting up, but inside the cabin there was warmth, safety, and a growing sense of connection. Jackson worked quietly by the fire, stoking the flames, while Lila slowly relaxed, the tension leaving her body bit by bit. They didn't speak much, but their shared presence was enough. Both of them understood, in their own ways, that this night would change something in their lives, even if they didn't yet know what. By the time the rain eased slightly and the wind softened to a steady howl, Lila was seated more comfortably, wrapped in the blanket, her wet hair drying slowly. Jackson could see the trust forming in her eyes, a trust that he hadn't given easily in years. And for him, the act of helping someone, protecting them from the storm, stirred feelings he hadn't expected. Feelings of responsibility, of care, and of hope. The storm was far from over, but for now in the small cabin on the edge of the Montana hills there was peace.
The two of them, strangers moments before, were now bound by circumstance, by kindness, and by the shared understanding of what it meant to face a storm and survive it. The storm outside had eased, leaving only the soft, steady sound of rain tapping against the roof and windows. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly, casting gentle shadows across the walls. Lila Harris had pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, sipping slowly from the steaming cup Jackson had given her. The warmth spread through her body, chasing away the chill that had seeped into her bones. For the first time since the storm had begun, she felt safe. Jackson sat across from her in his worn wooden chair, quietly watching her. He wasn't the type to talk much, but something about Lila's presence had a calming effect on him. Her eyes, still cautious but softer now, held a depth he hadn't seen in a long time. There was a quiet strength in her, even in her fear. He admired that without saying it aloud. "You must be cold," Jackson finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was low and steady, not demanding, but gentle. "You'll need to get out of those wet clothes soon, or you'll catch a chill." Lila nodded, setting her cup down on the small table beside her. She hesitated, glancing around the cabin as if measuring whether it was safe to trust him fully. I can manage," she said softly. "But—" "Thank you for everything." "I don't even know your name." "Jackson," he replied simply. "Jackson Cole. You can call me Jackson."
He gave her a small nod, a gesture of reassurance. "And you are—" "Lila!" she said, offering a tentative smile.
Lila Harris. For a moment there was silence again. Outside, the storm's roar had faded to a gentle patter, but inside the quiet carried a different weight. It was not empty. It was a space that allowed them to exist together without pretense, to feel without words. Jackson watched Lila as she pulled off her soaked coat, revealing a sweater clinging to her frame. She moved carefully, self-conscious about being exposed, yet she didn't complain. Jackson handed her a dry blanket from the chair next to him. "Wrap this around you for now. We'll get some dry clothes for you soon." Lila accepted it gratefully, feeling a small flicker of comfort. She looked around the cabin, noticing the details for the first time. The photographs on the wall of the Montana landscape, some of them faded with age. The well-worn tools neatly hung above the fireplace, the shelves stacked with jars of preserved food. Everything was simple, practical, and cared for. She could tell Jackson had spent years building this life with his own hands, with quiet attention and diligence. "You live here alone?" she asked cautiously, breaking the silence again. Jackson nodded. "Mostly. Been that way for years." "Helps to be out here with the land. Quiet. Peaceful. Gives you time to think." He paused, then added, almost as if to himself, "And keeps you away from trouble." Lila tilted her head, studying him. There was a weight behind his words, a hint of something he carried silently. She didn't press, sensing he would share if he wanted. Instead, she let the silence stretch, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't felt in a long time. After a while, Jackson moved to the small closet near the fireplace. He pulled out a set of dry clothes he had prepared for emergencies, a shirt, pants, and a warm pair of socks. "Here," he said, handing them to Lila. "Change into these. You'll feel better." Lila accepted them, retreating to the corner of the cabin to change. She was careful, mindful of her modesty, and Jackson respectfully looked away, keeping his focus on the fire. It was a small act of trust, this quiet boundary, and it didn't go unnoticed. When she emerged, dressed in the warm, dry clothes, she looked relieved and slightly embarrassed. "Thanks," she said, her voice lighter now. "This already feels so much better." Jackson nodded. "Good. Now, eat something. You must be hungry after all that running in the storm." He gestured toward a small table where he had set out simple food, bread, cheese, and some fresh fruit from the pantry. Lila hesitated at first, but hunger won over pride. She ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the cabin and the comfort of the meal. As she ate, Jackson moved around the cabin, checking on small tasks, making sure the fire stayed strong, the windows were secure against the wind, and the animals would be fine. Lila watched him, noticing the quiet efficiency in his movements, the way he seemed to know exactly what needed to be done without wasting a single motion. "You really know this land well," she said softly. Jackson looked up, meeting her eyes for a brief moment. "You have to if you want to live out here," he replied. "The land doesn't forgive mistakes." Lila nodded, understanding more than he realized. Life hadn't been easy for her either, though in a different way. She had spent years chasing a career in photography, traveling from town to town, always on the move, never staying in one place long enough to build anything lasting. It was exciting, yes, but lonely, and sometimes dangerous. The storm today was a reminder that life could turn on you in an instant, no matter how careful you were. "Do you take pictures?" Jackson asked, noticing the camera around her neck. Lila smiled faintly, holding it up.
Yes.
"I'm a photographer. I document small townspeople, landscapes, things that most people overlook. But today, I was caught off guard. The storm... I wasn't prepared for it." Jackson studied her silently for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Sometimes the things you're chasing aren't as important as the things you don't see coming." The words hung in the air between them, simple but meaningful. Lila looked at him, sensing that he knew more than he let on. There was a depth in his gaze, a quiet understanding of hardship, of loss, and perhaps of loneliness. She wanted to ask more, to uncover his story, but she hesitated. Some things were shared slowly, over time. Instead, she picked up her camera and began to clean the lens carefully, almost absent-mindedly. Jackson watched her, feeling an unusual sense of curiosity. He had lived a life of routine, of predictability, and yet there was something about her presence that made the cabin feel different. Not chaotic, but alive in a way it hadn't been before. "You have a good eye," he said finally. "Captures more than just what's in front of you." Lila looked up, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot." The evening wore on, and the storm outside diminished to a gentle drizzle. Jackson suggested she rest for a while, offering her the spare bed in the corner of the cabin. She hesitated, but the exhaustion from the day's events overcame her reluctance. "I'll be fine," she said. "Just a little rest." Jackson nodded, helping her settle in. He made sure the fire was still strong and that the cabin was secure. For a long while, he simply watched her breathe evenly, asleep at last, and he felt a strange sense of protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. There was a softness in him, a side he had buried deep beneath his rugged exterior. After she fell asleep, Jackson sat back in his chair, staring into the fire. Memories surfaced unbidden, memories of his brother, lost long ago in a tragic accident, of a relationship that had ended badly, leaving scars he had never fully healed. He realized that seeing Lila vulnerable, trusting him, stirred something in him, something he had thought long buried. The quiet hours of the night stretched on. Jackson thought about how life sometimes brought people together in unexpected ways. He had been alone for so long, convinced that solitude was the only safe path. But now, with this stranger resting peacefully in his cabin, he felt a flicker of connection, a reminder that life could be richer when shared, even if only briefly. Outside, the rain continued its gentle rhythm, tapping softly against the roof. Inside, the fire burned steadily, casting warm light across the cabin. Jackson allowed himself a small moment of reflection. The storm had brought Lila to him, yes, but it had also reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. That people mattered, that kindness mattered, and that even the most solitary of hearts could be touched by another. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the small windows, Jackson had made a quiet decision. He would help Lila. Not just through the storm, but for as long as she needed his help, and perhaps in doing so he could face parts of his own past that he had avoided for too long. For now, though, it was enough to sit by the fire, listening to the rain, and watch the first real smile appear on Lila's face as she awoke.
It was a small moment, simple and fleeting, but it carried a weight neither of them fully understood. And in that moment both Jackson and Lila felt the stirrings of something neither had expected. Trust, understanding, and the quiet beginnings of connection that could weather any storm. The morning sun filtered softly through the small cabin windows, casting a warm glow over the room. Outside, the storm had completely passed, leaving the hills glistening under a thin layer of mist. The animals in the pasture were calm, returning to their routines, and the wind carried the fresh scent of rain-soaked earth. Inside, Jackson Cole moved quietly, tending to small tasks around the cabin.
Even after years of living alone, mornings like this reminded him why he loved the solitude. The world outside could be chaotic, but here, everything had a rhythm. Lila was already awake, sitting at the table with her cup of tea in hand, staring at the soft light streaming through the window.
Her hair, though still damp, had dried in waves around her face. She felt an odd mixture of calm and unease. The storm had left more than wet clothes and muddy boots. It had stirred something inside her, a quiet reflection of the struggle she had carried with her for years. She had always been independent, always moving, never staying in one place long enough to let anyone see the real her. And yet, here she was, in a stranger's cabin, feeling unexpectedly safe. Jackson moved behind the counter of the small kitchenette, preparing breakfast. He offered her a simple meal of eggs, toast, and fresh fruit. Lila accepted it silently, watching him as he worked. There was something steady in his movements, a calm assurance that made the cabin feel like a safe haven. She wondered what life had been like for him, alone out here in the Montana hills, dealing with the hardships and solitude he must have faced.
"Do you live here alone all the time?"
she asked, her voice breaking the quiet. Jackson paused for a moment, then nodded.
"Most of the time," he said. "Some visitors come and go, but I mostly keep to myself. The land, it keeps you honest. It keeps you focused."
"And it doesn't talk back." Lila smiled faintly at his remark. There was a hint of humor in his voice, though it was buried beneath a layer of seriousness. She wanted to ask more about him, to understand the story behind those quiet eyes, but she hesitated. Instead, she let the moment pass, sipping her tea and listening to the sound of the fire crackling in the small stove. Jackson placed a plate of food in front of her and sat down across from her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, not forced. Then Lila looked down at the camera still hanging around her neck and asked, "Do you ever wonder why we remember certain things and forget others?" Jackson tilted his head, intrigued. "Sometimes," he admitted.
"Mostly the memories that stick are the ones that hurt the most, or the ones that teach you something you couldn't ignore." Lila nodded thoughtfully.
I know what you mean.
"I've traveled a lot, seen so many places, met so many people. But some memories keep coming back. They're like storms you can't escape no matter how far you run." Jackson studied her closely. There was a hint of pain in her eyes, a subtle tension in her voice. He had lived with his own storms for years, the kind no one could see. His brother's death had left a shadow over his life, and the mistakes he had made with people he loved haunted him still. He realized that Lila, in her own way, was carrying something similar, a burden she hadn't yet shared. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," he said gently. "But sometimes sharing a little helps." Lila looked at him, surprised by the kindness in his tone. She had spent most of her life learning to rely only on herself to keep her pain private. But there was something about Jackson's presence that made her want to trust him, even if just a little. I lost someone," she admitted quietly. "Not in the way you might expect. Just someone I thought I could count on, and then things went wrong. It left a mark on me." Jackson nodded, understanding more than he let on. He didn't ask for details, but his eyes softened. "People leave," he said simply. "Sometimes they leave even when you don't want them to. And sometimes you have to find a way to forgive them, or at least forgive yourself for holding on too long."
Lila's eyes filled with a quiet sadness.
She had always been too strong for her own good, too independent to ask for help. But sitting here, across from a man who had clearly faced his own hardships. She felt a fragile sense of connection. It was comforting, though she didn't yet know how to explain it. They ate in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with an unspoken understanding. Jackson watched her carefully, noticing the small ways she relaxed, the way she let the blanket fall from her shoulders, the way she allowed herself to sip tea slowly instead of gulping it down. Each small gesture told him more about her than words ever could.
After breakfast, Jackson suggested they'd check on the horses. Lila agreed, curious to see the animals and eager to distract herself from the weight of her thoughts.
The air was crisp and fresh after the rain, carrying the scent of wet grass and earth. Jackson led her out to the barn, showing her how to approach the horses, how to check their hooves, and how to feed them safely.
Lila listened attentively, following his instructions carefully.
You're good with them, she said finally, brushing hay from her jacket.
They seem to trust you, Jackson smiled faintly. They don't lie, he said.
Animals are honest. They sense who you are, and if you're steady, they'll respect you.
If you're not, well, they'll let you know.
Lila nodded thoughtfully. She thought about her own life, always moving, always running from something she couldn't name.
She realized that in Jackson's presence she felt steadier, more grounded. There was a calmness she hadn't experienced in years, and it was both comforting and unsettling. As they worked together, Jackson noticed Lila's camera dangling from her neck. "You're going to take pictures, aren't you?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded.
I try to.
Even in small towns, even in quiet moments, there's beauty everywhere if you look for it.
Jackson watched her carefully as she raised the camera and aimed it at the horses grazing peacefully in the misty morning light.
"Hold still,"
he said softly, almost instinctively. "It's deep." Lila blinked, surprised by the words. But when she looked at him, she saw sincerity, a quiet understanding that she hadn't expected. She focused on the frame, the camera capturing the moment, the animals, the soft light, the peacefulness of the scene, but also, in some unspoken way, capturing the connection between them. The rest of the morning passed with small shared tasks, feeding the animals, repairing a fence, and preparing a simple lunch. Each activity, though ordinary, carried a quiet intimacy. They were strangers, yes, but the storm had brought them together in a way that felt significant even if they couldn't yet put it into words. By mid-afternoon, Lila and Jackson had settled back inside the cabin. She sat by the window, reviewing her photographs while Jackson prepared a pot of tea. The quiet moments stretched on, filled with the comfort of shared presence. And yet, beneath the calm, both of them could feel the shadows of their pasts pressing gently at the edges of their thoughts. Jackson thought about his brother, the mistakes he had made, and the regrets he carried. Lila thought about the people she had lost, the trust that had been broken, and the moments she had wished she could take back. They both understood, in their own way, that the past was not something easily left behind. But for now, in this small cabin, they had each other. And that was enough to face the moments, however fleeting, with courage and hope. As the afternoon light faded into the soft glow of evening, Jackson finally spoke. "You've been through a lot," he said quietly. "And yet you keep going. That's something not everyone can do." Lila looked at him, a small smile forming on her lips.
"I try," she said softly.
"Some days are harder than others, but I keep moving." Jackson nodded, feeling a quiet respect for her resilience. "That's good," he said. "Keep moving. And sometimes it's okay to let someone help you along the way." The words hung in the air between them, gentle but heavy with meaning. Lila felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Trust. And Jackson felt a stir of emotion he hadn't felt in years. A sense of connection, of purpose, and of the possibility that healing could come, even in small, quiet steps. By the time night fell, the cabin was bathed in the warm glow of the fire. Lila had cleaned her camera and stored it carefully, and Jackson had checked the animals once more. They sat together in the quiet, not speaking, but comfortable in each other's presence. Outside, the hills were dark and peaceful, the world calm after the storm.
Inside, two people were beginning to understand each other, their pasts touching the present in ways they couldn't yet fully explain. And in that quiet cabin with the fire burning low and the night stretching ahead, both Jackson and Lila knew something had changed. The storm had brought them together, yes, but it had also stirred memories, emotions, and truths that would shape the days to come. For the first time in a long time, they both felt the possibility of healing. Fragile, uncertain, but real. The next morning, the cabin was quiet except for the soft sounds of the animals outside and the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. Jackson had risen early, as he always did, moving methodically through his morning routine. He checked the barn, ensured the animals were safe, and made a pot of strong coffee. The previous days had been calm, but Jackson could feel an unease lingering beneath the surface, a tension he couldn't ignore.
Lila, now more comfortable with the cabin and its rhythm, joined him for breakfast.
She moved with a quiet grace, setting the table and preparing tea while Jackson brought over the simple meal of eggs and toast. The two of them ate in companionable silence, occasionally exchanging small words. Even without speaking much, there was a growing understanding between them, a shared rhythm born from necessity, trust, and the quiet intimacy of shared space. But the peace of the morning was soon broken. A sudden knock at the cabin door startled them both. Jackson's hand instinctively went to the old revolver he kept on the wall. Not out of aggression, but caution.
The knock came again, firmer this time. Jackson's eyes narrowed.
Visitors were rare, and anyone out here in the hills usually had a reason for being seen and known. He approached the door cautiously and pulled it open.
Standing there was a man he had hoped he would never see again. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face lined from years of hard living, the man's eyes held a mix of anger and recognition. Jackson's heart tightened. This was Ethan Reed, a figure from his past. A man tied to the accident that had claimed his brother's life years ago. Jackson's first instinct was to retreat, to shut the door and pretend the man didn't exist, but he knew that wasn't possible. Ethan had found him, and there was no escaping what had happened. Lila watched from the corner, sensing the tension, her hands clutching the blanket around her shoulders.
"What do you want, Ethan?"
Jackson asked, his voice steady but cold. "I need to talk," Ethan said, his tone harsh but measured.
It's been a long time, Jackson. We can't just ignore what happened. Jackson's jaw tightened.
He had lived with the guilt of his brother's death for years, replaying every choice, every moment, wishing he could go back and change it. Ethan's presence now threatened to drag those memories back to the surface in a way Jackson wasn't sure he could handle.
"Not here," Jackson said finally, stepping aside reluctantly. "Come in, but stay out of my way." Ethan entered the cabin, his gaze flicking to Lila briefly before returning to Jackson. He had heard about the stranger Jackson had taken in from the storm but didn't comment on it. He knew better than to interfere with Jackson's personal matters. Not yet. "I've been looking for you," Ethan said quietly, taking a seat at the table. "We need to talk about what happened with your brother." "We left things unresolved, and it's time we face it." Jackson's hands clenched into fists. The memories of that day were sharp and painful, a wound that had never fully healed. He remembered the argument, the recklessness, the moment when his brother had slipped, and the weight of guilt that had followed him ever since. "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice tight. "I've lived with it every day." Ethan shook his head. "No, Jackson. You've carried it alone, and it's eating you from the inside. We need to face it together, finally. You can't keep running from it." Lila, sensing the rising tension, remained quiet but attentive. She could see the weight of the past pressing down on Jackson, the conflict that had been buried beneath years of solitude. She felt a pang of empathy. Everyone carried burdens, and sometimes those burdens needed to be confronted, no matter how painful. Jackson took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Fine," he said finally. "Talk, but this isn't easy." "It never will be." Ethan leaned back, his eyes serious. "It's never easy to face the past, Jackson, but you've been running for too long. And it's not just about what happened with my family or yours. It's about the choices we make, the people we hurt, and the ones we leave behind.
You need to understand that carrying it alone doesn't make it disappear.
Jackson felt a lump in his throat.
Ethan's words were true, painfully so. He had spent years in isolation, believing that keeping his pain private and avoiding the world would protect him. But he realized now that the past didn't disappear simply because he ignored it. It followed him, shadowed him, and now it demanded attention. Lila cleared her throat softly, surprising both men.
Maybe talking isn't just about reliving the past, she said gently. Maybe it's about understanding it, learning from it, and finding a way to move forward. I don't know the full story, but it seems like facing it together could help. Sometimes carrying the weight alone is heavier than sharing it.
Jackson looked at her, surprised by her insight. Her words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within him.
He realized that she was right. He had tried to shoulder everything alone, believing it was his burden to bear, but in reality, sharing the pain could lighten it.
Ethan nodded, acknowledging her words. "She's right," he said.
We can't undo the past, but we can face it. And maybe
we can find some peace. The conversation that followed was long and painful.
Jackson spoke of the accident, of the argument that led to his brother's death, and of the guilt that had haunted him for years. Ethan shared his perspective, offering forgiveness and understanding where it was needed. The process was uncomfortable, raw, and emotional, but it was necessary. Lila remained a quiet presence in the cabin, occasionally offering a word of encouragement or comfort. Her calm demeanor helped Jackson navigate the storm of emotions, and her support reminded him that he didn't have to face everything alone. As the hours passed, Jackson felt the weight of the past begin to lift, if only slightly. The confrontation with Ethan, though difficult, allowed him to release some of the guilt he had carried for so long. He realized that facing the truth, rather than avoiding it, was the only way to find peace. By evening, the tension in the cabin had eased. The fire burned warmly, casting soft light across the room. Lila and Jackson sat together, reflecting on the events of the day. The past had been confronted, the storm within Jackson's heart had been addressed, and for the first time in years he felt a sense of relief. Ethan left the cabin with a quiet nod, understanding that his part in Jackson's journey had been completed, at least for now. The presence of the past had been acknowledged, and Jackson had taken the first steps toward healing.
After Ethan departed, Jackson turned to Lila. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being here. For helping me see things differently."
I didn't realize how much I needed that.
Lila smiled softly, feeling the weight of the day's events.
We all need someone to help us sometimes, she replied, even if we don't realize it. Jackson nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. He felt a sense of gratitude for her presence, for her patience, and for her understanding. The storm outside had passed, and now, the storm within him had begun to ease. The night settled over the hills, peaceful and calm. The cabin felt warmer, not just from the fire, but from the sense of resolution and connection that had been established. Jackson and Lila sat quietly, knowing that the events of the day had changed something fundamental between them. The past had been faced, and now there was room for healing, growth, and the possibility of new beginnings. As they prepared for bed, Jackson felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in years. The confrontation had been difficult, but it had been necessary. Lila's presence had been a source of strength, a reminder that even the most rugged and solitary of hearts could find connection and understanding. For the first time in a long time, Jackson allowed himself to believe that the future might hold more than just solitude. There was hope, and with hope came the possibility of something deeper, something meaningful. The storm had tested them, but it had also brought clarity, forgiveness, and a renewed sense of purpose. And as the fire burned low and the night deepened, both Jackson and Lila felt a quiet sense of peace. The past had been faced, the present had been shared, and the future, though uncertain, seemed brighter than it had in years. The morning sun rose slowly over the hills, casting golden light across the dewy grass. The storm from days before had completely passed, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling. Jackson Cole moved quietly around the cabin, checking on the animals and making sure everything was in order. There was a sense of calm now that hadn't been there before, a quiet relief that came from facing the past. and surviving the storm together.
Lila stirred in the spare bed, stretching slowly as she felt the warmth of the sunlight on her face.
She had slept deeply, the first restful night she could remember in a long time.
The cabin, once foreign and strange, now felt safe and familiar. There was a subtle rhythm to the morning. Birds chirping outside, the horses grazing quietly, the distant rustle of the wind through the trees that seemed to reflect the renewed peace both she and Jackson felt inside. Jackson poured a cup of coffee and set it on the small table next to her. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning?" Lila replied, her voice soft but steady. She smiled faintly at him, a gesture of gratitude and connection. The events of the past few days had shifted something inside both of them. The storm had brought them together, yes, but it had also opened doors to emotions and healing that neither had expected. They ate breakfast together in companionable silence, the simplicity of the meal mirroring the simplicity of the life Jackson had built here. Lila noticed the care in his movements, the way he treated even small tasks with thoughtfulness and precision. It was a life built on responsibility and respect for the land, and she admired it deeply. After breakfast, Jackson suggested they take a walk through the pasture. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of wet grass and earth. The hills glistened under the soft sunlight, and the animals moved calmly, aware of the humans nearby but untroubled. Lila followed Jackson, her camera in hand, ready to capture the beauty of the morning. As they walked, Lila raised the camera to take a picture of the horses grazing in the soft light.
"Hold still," Jackson said softly, repeating the words he had used before.
"It's deep!" Lila smiled, understanding more than the literal meaning. It wasn't just about the photograph, it was about the moment, the connection, the quiet understanding that had developed between them.
She captured the image, framing not just the horses but the golden sunlight, the mist over the hills, and the sense of calm that had settled over the cabin. Jackson watched her, feeling a quiet sense of pride and relief.
For the first time in years, he felt a lightness in his chest, a sense that he could breathe without the constant weight of guilt and regret. The confrontation with Ethan had been difficult, but necessary.
It had forced him to face the past, to acknowledge the pain, and to begin the process of healing. And in that process, Lila's presence had been invaluable. They continued their walk, talking quietly about the land, the animals, and the simple routines of life on the ranch.
Lila asked questions, genuinely curious, and Jackson answered with honesty and thoughtfulness.
There was no pretense between them, no need for elaborate explanations or grand gestures. Their bond had formed in shared silence, in small acts of care, and in the quiet understanding that life could be both beautiful and challenging. By midday, they returned to the cabin. Jackson suggested a small project to pass the time, repairing a section of fence that had been damaged during the storm. Lila agreed, eager to contribute and to be a part of this life, even temporarily. Together they worked on the fence, measuring, hammering, and securing the posts. Their teamwork was effortless, built on mutual respect and the unspoken trust that had developed between them.
As they worked, Lila began to open up more about her life. She spoke of her travels, the towns she had visited, and the people she had met.
She shared moments of joy and moments of struggle, giving Jackson glimpses into a world he had never known. And in return, Jackson shared stories of his life on the ranch, the lessons he had learned from the land, and the quiet joys of living in harmony with nature.
By the late afternoon, the fence was complete. They stepped back to admire their work, the golden sunlight casting long shadows across the pasture. Lila took a photograph capturing not just the fence but the shared effort, the connection, and the sense of accomplishment that came from working together. As evening approached, Jackson prepared a simple dinner. The warmth of the cabin, the scent of food, and the quiet companionship created a sense of contentment neither had felt in years. They ate slowly, savoring the meal and the comfort of each other's presence. After dinner, Lila retrieved her camera once more. She reviewed the photographs she had taken over the past 2 days. Images of the storm, the animals, the cabin, and the hills bathed in sunlight. Each image told a story of struggle, connection, and resilience. She showed them to Jackson, who studied them quietly,
a faint smile on his lips. "These are good," he said finally. "They capture more than just the land." "They capture everything we've been through." Lila nodded, feeling a sense of fulfillment.
Photography had always been her way of understanding the world, of finding meaning in the ordinary. But these images, created with Jackson by her side, carried a deeper significance, a testament to survival, healing, and human connection. Night fell over the cabin and the two of them sat by the fire. The warmth of the flames, the quiet crackle of wood, and the peaceful darkness outside created a sense of intimacy and reflection. Jackson looked at Lila, noticing the calm confidence in her eyes, the way she carried herself with both strength and vulnerability. He realized that she had been a source of comfort and inspiration for him, helping him face his past and embrace the possibility of a future that was no longer defined solely by regret.
"You know," he said quietly, "I never thought I'd feel like this again."
"Not after everything that's happened. But being here, with you, it's different. I feel lighter."
Somehow, the past doesn't weigh so much anymore. Lila smiled softly, reaching out to place a hand on his. "Sometimes," she said gently, "all we need is someone to remind us that we're not alone. The past shapes us, yes, but it doesn't have to define us. We can choose what comes next." Jackson felt a warmth spread through him, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and hope. For years he had believed that solitude was the only safe path, that opening his heart would only bring more pain. But Lila's presence had shown him that connection, understanding, and care were not weaknesses. They were strengths. They spent the rest of the evening talking quietly, sharing stories, and simply enjoying the comfort of companionship. The storm had passed. The past had been faced. And the future, though uncertain, seemed full of possibility. Both Jackson and Lila felt the stirrings of hope, a recognition that life could be meaningful even after hardship. As the fire burned low, Jackson finally rose and walked to the window, looking out over the hills. The world was calm, peaceful, and alive with the quiet beauty of the Montana landscape. He felt a sense of gratitude for the land, for the animals, and most of all, for the unexpected presence of someone who had helped him begin to heal. Lila joined him at the window, her camera in hand. She looked out at the hills, the soft glow of the setting sun reflecting in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Almost like the world is giving us a second chance." Jackson nodded, feeling the truth of her words. Life had offered them both a second chance. A chance to face their pasts, to heal, and to find connection in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that things could be different, that the future could hold more than solitude and regret. The night deepened, and the cabin was bathed in the soft glow of the fire. Jackson and Lila settled into their places, feeling a quiet contentment. The events of the past days had tested them, challenged them, and forced them to confront difficult truths. But they had emerged stronger, more aware, and more connected to each other and to themselves. As they drifted toward sleep, both of them felt a profound sense of peace. The storm had brought them together, yes, but it had also brought clarity, healing, and the promise of something new. Jackson knew that he had faced the past and could now move forward with hope. Lila knew that she had found a moment of stability and trust in a life that often felt unpredictable.